Okay.
So we thought with the podcast, let's get a 50-some-year-old and a 20-some-year-old together and have different viewpoints on the things of life, right?
Yes, right.
So that's kind of the
so you decided to bring a 60-something in.
So we gotta square it out, and we're gonna have a toddler next week.
Yeah. we try to have one person every week who knows what they're talking about. Usually it's not us, so.
I see, okay.
Today's guest is David Koyzis. David holds a Ph.D. in Government and International Studies from the University of Notre Dame. He has taught undergraduate political science for 30 years. He is the author of a book titled We Answer to Another, Authority, Office, and the Image of God, published in 2014 by Pickwick. And the new second edition of his highly acclaimed book, Political Visions and Illusions, came out last year, published by InterVarsity Press. It's the very best book I've ever read about politics from a Christian worldview. It is, in this book, David does a thorough survey of the various political ideologies of our age and offers a Christian critique of each. He then lays out alternative models, politically deep thinking, from Christians over hundreds of years. This is a book with a broad international and historical perspective, so it is not bogged down by the punditry that we see infecting many of our books here. This is not only an equal opportunity critique, but it is also a book of hope, that we can move beyond the ideologies that divide us in our civil and public life. So welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Your book explains the, I guess, dominant ideologies of our day, being, liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, democracy, and socialism. You say that each of these ideologies is inescapably religious. So would you care to elaborate more on what you mean by that?
Yeah, certainly. Yes, I don't think religion is something that can be during this time of COVID pandemic, I'll say it can't be quarantined to a particular corner of our lives. I think everything we do following some religious conviction about the nature of the world and about our place in the world. And we if we believe in the one true God, that's going to the God who has revealed himself in uniquely in Jesus Christ. That's going to affect the way that we live our lives. If we confess some other God, then that too will affect the way that we live our lives. And I think each of these particular political ideologies is rooted in a worldview that takes something within the creation and elevates it to the position of a God. And that thing is going to vary between the ideologies. Doesn't mean that thing itself is bad. Individual freedom is a very good thing. Communal solidarity is a very good thing. But it's when we make too much of those, that's when we go astray.
They ask us to put all of our faith into one thing in the created order. Is that the issue?
Yeah, it could be more than one thing, but yes. So something, they're all based on some element on a redemptive story that has us saving ourselves through some sort of activity that we're involved in.
So, is it fair to say that each of these ideologies has an element of inherent truth, but also elements that are just inherently wrong or, I guess, incomplete?
Well, I don't think I would say that it has elements that are inherently wrong, because I think if we look at liberalism, for example, liberalism is an ideology that makes a great deal of individual liberty or individual freedom, and that freedom is always seen as something that belongs to the individual. That's a very good thing. We should be thankful that we live in countries that have constitutional protections for individual liberties, individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and so forth. Those are all very good things. But I think what happens is that those very good things are made too much of, and that's when things go wrong. And this is something that that Augustine, 100 years ago understood, and I think it's an insight that we need to recognize. At the opening of Augustine's Confessions, he has this famous phrase that's been quoted right and left, addressing himself to God. He says, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." And I think that's a good description of what human beings are, of who human beings are, that we are restless. We are looking for rest in some way. And if we find our rest, if we try to find our rest in something or someone other than the God who has created and saved us, then we will continue to be restless.
Many of us who are not political scientists only understand politics from what we've seen on cable news or from an opinionated Christian leader. So we may think we know what these different ideologies are, but they represent very specific political frameworks. So let's tackle these in rapid succession, if you'd help us. I'll name the ideology, and if you can define it for us, tell us what the positives it contributes to society, and each one introduces when we reduce it to becoming the sole religious political ideology of a nation.
Right.
So the first one is liberalism. What is liberalism?
Right. Yeah, liberalism is basically an ideology that tries to make all communities into voluntary associations, bringing together individuals of their own accord. So, in other words, there's no real difference between a chess club and a body politic. For example, or marriage is no real different than a friendship. So there's an effort to try to reduce everything to, you could say market relations. There's a certain kind of liberalism, a kind of an older type of liberalism that wants to that makes much of the market, of the free market, and tries to form society, refashion society, so that it conforms to the voluntary character of the market. Later liberalism is not quite so keen on the market, but it still wants to try to enhance freedom of choice as much as possible. And if that means that the state has to intervene to try to create those options for us, then so be it.
When we hear liberal here in America, we think of Democratic Party. So is there a difference between Republicans and Democrats in America as far as liberalism is concerned?
Well, they both adhere to liberalism in some fashion, and
so liberalism is a good thing.
Well, I would say
what's good and what's bad about it is the question, I guess.
Yeah, I would say the liberty is a good thing. The fact that people have options in life is a good thing. But not everything is necessarily subject to choice. I was born in a particular birth family. I did not choose my parents, but yet, the Bible tells us that we are to honor our parents. That's not something that I freely consented to. That's a command, and a lot of life is like that. We have obligations that we need to fulfill to the communities of which we are part, especially the communities that we are born into. So all of us are born to citizenship in some country, and that means that we have obligations to the country of our birth. We have to pay taxes. We have to obey the laws. We have to, we ought to participate in political life when called upon to do so. So liberty is a good thing. I think liberalism, as soon as you add the ism to the end of something, that may tell us that we're on we're on a bit of a precarious path, shall we say.
The next one is conservatism. What is that?
Right. Well, conservatism is a little bit different from the other ideologies that I treat in my book, in that it does not obviously have a particular redemptive narrative. The conservatives are generally not trying to save the world. They're generally not trying to bring about some kind of supremely just social order of some sort. They generally have more modest expectations. So conservatism, it can be defined in a variety of different ways. But whenever anybody calls him or herself a conservative, the first thing you have to ask them is, well, what is it that you want to conserve? And of course, depending on whom you're talking to, you're going to get different responses. Do you want to conserve the autocracy of the Tsar in 19th century Russia? Do you want to conserve the constitutional order of the United States? Maybe the constitutional monarchy of Canada or the United Kingdom? What is it that you want to conserve? So there's this focus on tradition, and usually for conservatives, it's our own tradition. So they want to conserve the traditions that have shaped their polities, their countries, their nations, their peoples, and tradition becomes all important.
Well, ever since Ronald Reagan, Christians have seen themselves as conservatives. So, what is good and what is problematic with that?
Yeah, that's right, and I think the best of conservatives understand that the other ideologies are not necessarily submitting their proposals to a reality check. They have ideas about what they want to bring about what they want to implement. They have these grand proposals, but often, and this is when ideologies can become the most destructive. If flesh and blood people with their aspirations stand in the way, well, we don't change our proposals, but we have to somehow change those people. We have to, we might even have to get rid of them. And of course, that's when you get into such ideologies as National Socialism and Marxism-Leninism, and they're totalitarian ideologies. So conservatives in general have good instincts with respect to proposals for change, proposals for reform. But there's also a considerable negative side to conservatism as well. So conservatives sometimes place too much emphasis on tradition. And they don't really have any criteria by which to assess a given tradition. For example, in the American South, prior to the 1960s, and maybe to some degree even to the present time, the tradition of racial segregation. If you're simply a conservative and you want to conserve whatever happens to be in place, then you're not going to change that, however bad it is, however unjust it is, however whatever harm it might inflict on flesh and blood people. And conservatives are often limited to trying to limit damage, to try to keep things from getting worse. But if you ask them, what is your vision for the future? Or what is your source of hope? They probably, or they may not be able to tell you.
So David, the next ism we have is nationalism. And it seems especially, over these past 4 years with the presidency of Donald Trump, we have edged into the political ideology of nationalism more than, America has probably seen in a while. So what exactly do you think is happening with nationalism and what we're currently seeing in the Trump presidency?
Yeah. Nationalism, it can manifest itself in different ways. It's obviously based on loyalty to nation, but in the way that I describe it in the book, it's an exaggerated loyalty. In its worst form, it comes to take precedence over all other legitimate considerations that might call for particular policies. Liberals are free traders. Nationalists, not necessarily so. So nationalists are more likely to be protectionists. They want to set up protective tariffs to subsidize domestic industry. They want to try to increase employment as much as possible. And it's not to say that protective tariffs are out of bounds, because I think they can be used in a way to help our neighbors in some way. But there are also dangers to that as well. Because after the stock market crash of 1929 and the advent of the Great Depression, you had economic warfare breaking out among different nations around the world. And of course, that with the protective tariffs being put in place by the United States, Great Britain, Germany, etc. Germany under Hitler had this notion of autarky. We want to produce everything at home. We don't want to have to depend on other nations in order to get along, and we'll make ourselves great in so doing. And of course, that economic warfare led eventually to military warfare, scarcely 10 years later. So there's a there's an element of populism that's involved as well, and I don't treat populism as a distinct ideology in my book, but I think we can say that that there's this element of populism as a particular leader tries to appeal to a certain demographic, and oftentimes it's a demographic that feels itself to have been left out in some way, to have lost out in the economic game, if I can use that kind of a metaphor. And so then you get people like Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, maybe Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, Viktor Orban in Hungary, that are trying to appeal to a particular demographic and to capitalize on some sense of solidarity, to build a sense of solidarity within the nation. And that solidarity is a good thing. People should have a feeling of kinship with their fellow citizens. So that itself is a good thing, but I think when it comes to take precedence over every other consideration, that's when we get into the territory of idolatry.
Sure, right. And then I think when you kind of get into that idolatrous territory, along with that, you sort of get a, our nation versus the world mentality.
Yes.
Or even if it's within your own political party or so forth, it's that us versus them.
That's right, yes.
And
that's right.
Like you said, like in the case of Nazi Germany, that it leads to warfare.
That's right, yeah.
So moving forward to our fourth ideology is democracy. In America, we believe our ideal is that America is a democracy. So I suppose the first question is America really a democracy? And then I guess our second American assumption is that, I think we're kind of raised in America to believe democracy is the ultimate good political system. So I guess the second question to ask is that true, and are there downsides?
Right. Democracy is a good form of government, but I always quote Sir Winston Churchill, who famously said in this was taken by Hansard in a parliamentary speech, and he said democracy is the worst form of government except for all those others. And it's you're not going to have idolatrous expectations for democracy if you make a statement like that. Recognizing that. Well, he also said, what else did he say? He said that when I'm overseas, he says I never criticize my country's government when I'm overseas, but when I come home, I make up for lost time. So there was Churchill with all this the pithy quotation, and is a brilliant man, and I think that's a pretty good description of democracy. It's not the ultimate aim of political life. At most, it's a means, and one hopes an effective means to the securing of justice within a particular political community. So democracy itself is as a form of government is good. It's not perfect. I don't think anybody would claim that it was perfect. And as a matter of fact, that's the beginning of the Churchill quote. Nobody claims that it's perfect. But democratism happens when people invest redemptive expectations in what is otherwise a good form of government. So after the collapse of communism, when the wall was opened on the 9th of November, 1989 in Berlin, and suddenly people could go into West Berlin, and they didn't go to the Rathaus, the city hall, to see what politics is really like. They went to the Kurfürstendamm, the shopping district, and they walked down to do window shopping, and for them, that was what democracy was. It meant prosperity of the West that they wanted to have in the former East Germany. And democracy was what they were looking for, because they saw it as a means not necessarily to justice, but to prosperity, which they envied the Westerners in the western part of Germany for having. So in that respect, democracy, it's a means to an end, but I think we have to be careful not to make democracy itself the end of our political strivings. And to be honest, there are some states around the world that are simply not capable of democracy at the present time. So,
absolutely.
Representative government depends on traditions, pre-existing traditions that enable people to engage, to participate in political life. So when the Americans fought their war for independence in the 1770s and the very beginning of the 1780s, they had more than a century of experience self-government within their respective colonies. Beginning in 1619 with the establishment of the first colonial assembly in the Virginia colony. And so when the American states became independent, they had traditions of self-government on which they could easily draw, not to mention the English Constitution, which also provided traditions that were they had developed on the other side of the Atlantic. But if you go to a country like Iraq, for example, and I think this is one of the mistakes of the George W. Bush administration, assuming that it was possible to make a country like Iraq into a shining beacon of democracy for the entire Middle East. Iraq is not really a cohesive state, cohesive nation. It was created just over a century ago by the French and the British, who divided the former Ottoman Turkish territories between the two of them, and you need to have some sense of cohesive nationhood for there to be even a possibility of representative government. It's also true that other countries that have tried an American-style presidential republic have ended up becoming dictatorships at some point. So a tradition that works well, institutions that work well in one historical context may not work equally well in another context.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's an important thing that a lot of Americans have hopefully are realizing.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, I really hope we don't find another country to invade and try to set up a democracy in the next 10 years. That'd be great.
I wouldn't advise it, no.
Yeah. The last ideology that I have is socialism. And I think socialism is, especially with the upcoming election, has been a big one that's on a lot of people's minds, because obviously we have these prominent politicians, especially in the Democratic Party, that are campaigning on more openly socialist platforms, like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Are they true socialists? Are they just pioneering socialist ideology? And I guess the first question would be, how would you define socialism as an ideology?
Yeah, socialism very much values communal ownership of property. And to which I say, this is very good. But it's something that we already have. We already have communal ownership of property. We have corporate ownership. Businesses are owned corporately. If you can talk about the home where I'm living in the house, it's our family home. Our family owns this home. We can talk about public parks. Parks that belong to everybody, but are administered by municipal authorities, or perhaps state or provincial authorities, or in the case of national parks, by a federal parks administration of some sort. So we have communal ownership of property. What socialism wants to try to do is to fold all of those different communities into one single community. So, and it would represent somehow the people as an undifferentiated community. So corporate ownership means everybody owns everything. It means that all Russians own all of Russia indiscriminately. And of course, that's not something that's really feasible in the real world. Even during the communist era in the Soviet Union, people were allowed to have their own garden plots. And those garden plots that were owned outright by people were wildly productive, whereas collective farms and state farms were not nearly as productive. So they were supposed to be owned communally by the people, but the people cannot be a responsible agent. You have to look at real communities, families, chess clubs, garden clubs, museums, dance troupes, and the like, schools, universities, and the like, and then we can start to talk about ownership. But socialism tries to fold all of those different varieties of ownership into one single form.
You need to have an institution that has kind of specific shared common interests that are going to motivate people to act on behalf of that organization. And
that's right.
I think the issue with viewing an entire nation as an organization is that nations are very diverse, full of different people with different interests, different motivations, different desires. And
that's right.
You even, I think, sometimes have a disagreement on what the ideal people that are representative of your nation look like. I think you're seeing that in if you want to say socialist nation like China right now with the
Right.
concentration camps and so forth.
I
Who is a
know,
Chinese
yeah.
person? What's the ideal
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Chinese
that's right.
citizen look
Yeah,
like?
yeah.
So it's interesting to think about that. Republicans use the term socialism as a all-encompassing evil. It's kind of
That's
become a
right.
buzzword within the last few
It's true.
years.
That's
So
right. Yeah.
you've kind of described some of the inherent problems with it, but are there kind of some bright spots with socialism?
Bernie Sanders, it's difficult for me to say whether he really is a socialist or not. Socialism is supposed to be all about solidarity. Solidarity amongst. In the Soviet Union, everybody was called tovarish, which is the Russian word for comrade. But in reality, in the Soviet Union. Horizontal ties of solidarity were discouraged. It was only vertical ties between individuals in the party. Those were encouraged. So ironically, this solidarity never really took root in the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, it was ruthlessly suppressed. Now, Bernie Sanders, in many respects, is a lone wolf. Bernie Sanders is not really, he's not Vladimir Lenin. He's not Joseph Stalin. He's not the leader of a particular socialist party. He's simply one person representing probably a fairly small faction within the Democratic Party.
He does call himself a democratic socialist. So
Well, that's right.
He doesn't want to call himself a full socialist.
Yeah, and virtually every country, Western country, has a democratic socialist party of some sort. So in Canada, we have the New Democratic Party. In Great Britain, they have the Labour Party. The Netherlands has the Partij van de Arbeid. It's the Party of Labour once again. So the United States is the only country, Western country, advanced democracy, that does not have a democratic socialist or a social democratic party. That bears the label. So in some ways, it's surprising. I've been surprised over the last several years at how readily many younger Americans have taken to this claim to be pushing socialism, because that certainly was not the case prior to 1989. Socialism was always like a cuss word, and it was the kiss of death. If you claimed to be a socialist in the American context, that would end your political career right there. You would never go anywhere. That's changed, and I think partly because the younger generation doesn't remember Marxism, Leninism. They don't remember the Soviet Union. There's of course Venezuela, which is not exactly the best example of socialism. Either, but that's not in very many people's radar screens in the same way that the Soviet Union was during the Cold War.
So it's a naivete on their part to embrace socialism.
That's right. Yeah.
Just a final thought of encouragement to Christians as we enter into the final phase of our presidential election season. Any words of encouragement to us?
This is what I've been telling people. Cast your vote. Wouldn't dream of telling you which party to vote for. I think there are flaws with both parties. Rather considerable flaws with both parties. Cast your vote. Hold your nose if you have to, as you do so. Don't have exaggerated expectations as to what the various parties and the candidates will be able to accomplish. Don't expect the arrival of the kingdom of God through the auspices of a particular political party. But at the same time, whoever you vote for, pray for whoever ends up winning the offices, and pray that the defects of the various parties and candidates, that God in His grace will see fit to lessen them, and to lessen their effect on the public.
Isn't it sad that that's what we need to pray?
No, I think
keep this from being keep this from being too damaging, please.
I think that would be an honest prayer at any time in human history.
I think it is. It's true. I know. It's quite true. Yeah.
It's an honest assessment, especially since the problem I see in American politics is that we really put all our eggs in a basket of saying this is salvation is found here with this
Yeah.
candidate or this
Oh, yeah.
party. This
Oh, my
will
goodness. Yeah.
overcome the evil that we see.
I know.
And that is what you were talking about. That is idolatry. That is
Yeah,
putting
it is.
Yeah,
something
Yeah.
on a creational thing that is not meant to have it.
I think they've done that in some other nations historically, like Russia and China and Cambodia, and it didn't go super well.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I know. Boy.
It might be in those situations, it might have been a different ideology, but it was still all of their hope in one ideology.
Well, that's right. And in that case, it almost doesn't matter what the ideology is.
Right.
As long as you have people that believe that they're going to be ushering in the perfect society, well, then whatever they're telling you, be very suspicious and be very wary.
Absolutely.
Thanks, David.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, it was great having you here.
Yeah, good to meet you, Brendan.
Thank you. It was great meeting you as well.
Okay.